All right, good afternoon. My name is Mara Carlin. I direct Strategic Studies and the Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And I am really excited to have two of my very favorite people in the entire world here to talk about their fantastic new book, Adaptation Under Fire. The plan for today, before I introduce them, is that I'll spend some time asking them questions, and then please feel free to use the chat button, the Q&A button that you all will see at the bottom of your screen, and shoot over questions that I'll then ask them after the first 25 minutes or so. I will say that I will preference questions from students, so if you're a student, please do note that in case I don't know you. All right, so Professors Barno and Bensahel, in many ways need no introduction, I suspect, but I'd like to briefly do so. So Professor Bensahel is a visiting professor of strategic studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and she's a senior fellow at the Merrill Center. She has an illustrious career as a PhD, having worked at many of the top think tanks and federally funded research centers around the security studies landscape. Her partner in crime is Professor David Barno. He's a retired lieutenant general who spent 30 years in the US Army, did all sorts of things there, including his last assignment, which is commanding US and coalition forces in Afghanistan from 2003 to 2005. He, like her, is of course a visiting professor of strategic studies at SAIS and a senior fellow at the Merrill Center. So let me bring them in. We'll, unveil the curtain so you can see them here. Fantastic. It always feels a little bit funny to introduce them separately because in so many ways they are kind of this just extraordinary combination. It's one of the many reasons why I'm so excited to have them on the team at SAIS, because they have, as you briefly heard, two very different sets of life experiences, and they've brought those together to teach extraordinary things, to write this fantastic book. To be honest, when I read this book, all I kept thinking was, why didn't this exist before? We needed this book. And so I'm so happy that it is finally done and that they've been able to pull it together. I should also note, if you are new to them and new to this topic, you need to go to War on the Rocks right now and start reading their pieces regularly. I think my students are starting to wonder if I'm getting a little bit of a payoff each time I cite them, because I realize it's becoming embarrassingly regular. But that's just a sign of how terrific they are. So Professor Bensahel, Professor Barno, so good to have you both. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for hosting this, and thanks for the very kind introductions.
It's great to be here, and no one is happier than we are that the book is finished, trust me.
You're teeing up my very first question. Writing a book is a bit of a miserable and torturous experience. So my first question for both of you is, why did you put yourself through this? Why did you write this book?
It's an excellent question, and we asked ourselves that many times over the 4-year process that we were working on it, writing it and revising it. The quick answer is that we are growing increasingly concerned that the US military is not adaptable enough for the conflicts that it's going to face in the future. And that's really the question that motivated the book. We were also teaching a class on adaptation a number of years ago. We taught it for the first time at Georgetown in the security studies program there, because we thought that this question of adaptation and being adaptable for the future was such an important question. And as we put together the syllabus, we realized that there really wasn't anything that we could assign that covered what we wanted to cover. There had been work on military innovation, which is usually during peacetime, but nothing that focused on how do you adapt once a war starts, that focused on it the way that we thought it needed to be addressed. And this is why, of course, teaching and research go together hand in hand, because we looked at each other and we said, I think there's a book here, and then proceeded to spend, as I said, many years working on it until it was published in September.
That makes a lot of sense.
I'd add to that too. I think that one of the big gaps we saw is there is some literature, which we obviously found when we taught our class on adaptation prior to the year 2000, prior to the start of the new millennium, but there's very little in the subsequent period of time. And so the middle third of our book really looks at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the degree to which the U.S. military, showed adaptation or didn't, in the various elements of doctrine, technology, and leadership that we use as a framework throughout the book. That was a critical part of our rationale for writing the book, is that nobody had really taken a hard look at the last 20 years of war and made some judgments about whether the U.S. military was adaptable enough to be effective in these wars.
Absolutely. And you come out with some really strong conclusions, of course, that we'll get to in a moment. So that's helpful in getting us to understand why you would put yourselves through a little bit of a miserable experience to write this fantastic book. Just even looking through it, I mean, the footnotes alone and the bibliography alone are just extraordinary resources for folks who are interested in these topics. So I want to spend a moment on each of you. You have these different life experiences, and so it means you bring something different to the table. I think it often ends up being pretty magical, watching how you two pull things together and sort of debate and spar and kind of get us to a better intellectual place. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, about the experience of your different backgrounds, trying to write this book together, kind of how you navigated that, where you found yourselves kind of pushing one another?
What a great question. And we don't get asked that question too much. You may get different answers from both of us. I'm not quite sure. We don't entirely understand why this partnership works, but it does. I think it has to do with the fact that we do come from very different backgrounds and experiences, but we're interested in the same subjects, we're concerned about the same issues, and we share a set of values about our work and what we put into it, what types of questions we want to ask, how we, that we value what comes out more than whatever inputs either of us particularly, submits to the process. We both can do everything that we do, obviously, but there's a little bit of a difference in what we're each better at. I think Professor Barno tends to be a little bit better at the big think and conceptualizing big ideas. And I think I'm a bit more meticulous in the execution and attention to detail. I was laughing when you mentioned the footnotes because that was a joke between the two of us. Professor Barno has often said he contributed 5 and I contributed the other 1,000, which is not true, but I have more attention to detail and can scope it. I think that's a real advantage for him in our columns because he has the big ideas and can draft things very quickly that we then go back and forth on. And we've been doing that for almost 6 years. It'll be 6 years in January that we've been writing our column. But our relationship changed a little bit in our relative strengths to each other for the book, because having gone and gotten a PhD, I know how to conceptualize a big project. And I think that was a bit challenging for him at some points as well.
No, it's a unusual partnership, to say the least. And as Professor Bensahel pointed out, it really kind of started with War on the Rock, started with teaching and working in a think tank together at Center for New American Security before that. And so I think we came to the table with after the first few months of working together at CNES with a lot of respect for our intellectual capabilities, our differing writing capabilities, and what we both brought to the table. And so that was helpful. And as we started writing a column, we were writing a column initially every 2 weeks, which was backbreaking. And we've now written about 85 columns for War on the Rocks over the last 6 years, which I was foolish enough to say when we started the book project that the book couldn't be any harder than writing about 50 columns or so. We've done that. How hard can that be? Which was totally insanely wrong. So
to which I screamed, by the way. That noted.
so the dynamics writing the column actually were helpful, I think, in terms of going into the book project. That we both knew kind of what our strengths and weaknesses were, and we knew what we wanted to do, and we were going to see it through to the end. And we've written some longer reports both in the think tank world and independently as well. We wrote a fairly long report on the future of the Army a number of years ago. So, but a book is a completely different kettle of fish, and that certainly put lots of stresses on the various capabilities we both brought to the table at different times. And at the same time, we were still writing a column, although now once a month. But even that remains a challenge, and there's lots of extremely sparky conversations as we get to what we are agreeing on and disagreeing on, and whether we have it quite read or not. In some ways, the book was less contentious, I think, in that regard. But it's still just the long duration of that and the number of iterations you have to go through to get it right. And that's one of the things that we do share, is an absolute commitment to get it right no matter how long it takes.
Absolutely, and that's reflected in the work, and it's just so incredibly valuable. I mean, I have a lot of difficulty finding another team like you two when I look across the broad national security field. And on one level, you know, that's heartening, right? It just shows how unique this partnership is. On another level, it's also really sad because I think the two of you in your very different backgrounds are able to bring together a lot of magic that we don't necessarily see, you know, kind of on these important issues. So let's dive in a bit to some of what you know we're seeing in the book. You know, effectively, you've kind of got this triumvirate of how one thinks about adaptation, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts based on the research. You know, you've got this great lit review. You look at these last 2 decades of conflict. Talk us through what this means for the U.S. military. How ready is it for these unforeseen future conflicts? You know, we all know the infamous Secretary of Defense Bob Gates quote about just how terribly prepared, you know, the U.S. has been. I had talked to my students, I think just about 2 weeks or so ago, about how much time, you know, the U.S. Military spent in the Cold War focused on the potential of a nuclear conflict, and it got Vietnam. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? How ready is it?
Well, I think the book itself helped inform our thinking about, you know, what eventually our judgment was going to be. And I think we came in with some suspicions, but with certainly not a final judgment on how adaptable was the U.S. military. But in the book, we looked at, in the first third of the book, at the 20th century, we looked at a number of examples of successful adaptability, unsuccessful adaptability. And as I noted earlier, you know, the boxes we put that in were the doctrine box, how you prepare for war, you know, the roadmap, the blueprint your forces use to fight. You know, the box of technology, what kind of weapons and equipment are you going to choose to fight the war, and then the leadership box. And we also took a look at the tactical level in both technology adaptation and in adaptation for leadership, and the more senior level, institutional or the theater level for leadership. And we found some different things there. So as we started to flow from the 20th century into the current wars, we actually started to see a lot of things that were common between how the U.S. military performed, let's say in World War II or Vietnam, or even in the small wars period in the 80s, and how the U.S. military ended up performing in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so some of those conclusions started to suggest to us that these were going to be long-standing seams or flaws in terms of the adaptability of the U.S. military as a whole. And so as we kind of came to the end of it, I think a lot of those perceptions were reinforced when we took a hard look at its recent performance and then kind of assessed where the holes and gaps were as it began to look at a very, very different future out there.
Yeah, and part of that assessment, frankly, as we looked forward from what we had learned from the past, was realizing that even if the US military had been perfect at adapting in all of its previous conflicts, I mean, of course, no military could ever do that, but even if we had been remarkably adaptable, the challenges of 21st century warfare are going to require far more adaptability even than the wars of the recent past. And we talk about that resulting from the fact that the strategic environment that the United States is in is remarkably complicated and changing, feels like on a near daily basis. So much change and so much turmoil, not clear at all how that's all going to shake out. Mm-hmm. We have this exponential growth in technology, which is reshaping societies, how our societies work and function, how we all live. And that includes the weapons of war, but also more broadly, just how our societies operate, as I said. And we're also looking at 2 entirely new domains of warfare in outer space and cyberspace, which means enormous complexity. You know, we've had 2 domains of warfare, air and land, for thousands of years, but the air domain is only, you know, 125-ish years old. And now there are 2 entirely new domains. So looking forward, what we call the adaptation gap, the degree of adaptation that's going to be needed between what we anticipate and what happens, we think that's only growing because all of these additional factors. We also often, you know, one of the questions we often get is, well, isn't the US military still more adaptable than anyone else? And it may well be, but the problem is that for the United States as a global power, the range of conflicts that we have to prepare for, that the US military might be called upon to do, is as big as the conflict spectrum itself. So if I were to, you know, infiltrate all of China's top secret war plans, I'm pretty sure that they would be focused on the United States and US allies in the Pacific. If I were to do the same for Russia, I'm pretty sure it would be focused on the United States and US NATO allies. But if you're the United States, you don't know if it's going to be Russia or China, or if it's going to be North Korea or Iran or Afghanistan or ISIS or something entirely else. Whether it's going to have elements of a conventional conflict and gray zone conflict with elements of guerrilla warfare and so on. So even though the US military probably is more adaptable than our peers and maybe even our adversaries, just the degree of adaptability that the US as a global power has to have is markedly greater than anyone else, which is one of the reasons why we're so concerned about it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you do this really nice thing, and particularly in the first part of the book, where you walk through other case studies, non-US case studies. And that's sort of such a kind of a healthy and sober reminder that one does need to look at others. And, you know, it seems to me you have this good chart on the adaptation gap. And I think it's making this point you were just saying, Professor Bensahel, which is it's all going to be exponential, right? So this was hard enough. And Professor Barno, I mean, I think what I'm really hearing from you is we saw this thread long ago, and this thread continued, but it kind of burst open in terms of the kind of character of the challenge.
Yeah, I think we're underestimating how hard it's going to be, frankly, and that's the idea of the adaptation gap. There's always been a gap between the war that militaries expected and the war they encountered. But now, instead of that being between 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock, it's liable to be between 12 o'clock and 5 o'clock, or 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock. And we still think we've got the adaptation thing down because it's only going to be what we have experienced in the past. And that fundamentally is not going to be true, I'm afraid.
That's such a superb way of putting it. So actually, that's a great hook because I wanted to spend a moment on leadership. And before I get to this question, let me just know for participants, I'll turn to you shortly. So if you want to start populating the Q&A with your questions, I look forward to them. So you look at leadership, right, from multiple levels, right, from the tactical level, from the strategic level. And I'd be curious to hear kind of your thoughts on how adaptive you really see the post 9/11 military leaders. It seemed to me, as someone reading it, you saw a bunch of examples at the tactical level, but you had some strategic level examples that weren't terribly heartening. I was particularly struck by the story of General George Casey. Can you talk us a little bit through those findings? And frankly, to the extent you have advice then, you know, how do you build better, you know, more adaptable senior military leaders? What does that look like?
Yeah, maybe I'll talk about the example of General Casey, and Professor Barno can take some of the recommendations that we think follow for developing leaders for the future. You're right, it is a very unsettling and disturbing case study. When General George Casey was in command in Iraq from 2004 to 2007, the war in Iraq was spiraling downward. I know you, Professor Carlin, you were in the Pentagon for some of those years. You know, each day felt like it brought new and worsening news, you know, by any conceivable metric: number of insurgents, number of enemy attacks, number of Iraqi civilians killed. Those numbers were all going, you know, increasing and skyrocketing. General Casey, as the theater commander, bore primary responsibility for the strategy that was implemented and for the overall approach in theater. And he unfortunately got it very wrong. He had a lot of views from his previous experience being part of the generation that rebuilt the military after Vietnam, and particularly from his experience in Bosnia, of all things, being involved in peacekeeping missions there. He came into that with two key assumptions that were never challenged, no matter how bad things got in Iraq. And that had to do with the fact that the Iraqis needed to make a political process progress before there could be any concerted military role for the military to, you know, to help stabilize things, and made some very big assumptions that US forces were causing a lot of the pushback, that its mere presence in cities and in towns was causing insurgent attacks, and so decided to posture US forces on very large bases that were isolated from the population. he did a lot of things which seemed like a counterinsurgency strategy. He talked about counterinsurgency. He established something called the Counterinsurgency Academy in Taji, Iraq, to teach counterinsurgency. But that principle of keeping the US military away from the population and on large bases undermined everything else he tried to do in counterinsurgency. It's perhaps understandable he would go in with those assumptions. What we found just very disturbing is over the course of his almost 4-year tenure, no matter how bad things got, those key assumptions were never revisited, even when you would think that the evidence would be there to say, we have to try something else, we have to try a different approach. And that, I've been talking a great deal about General Casey. That is mostly what we found at that theater level and at the institutional level, that, many theater commanders, certainly not all, but many theater commanders and the bureaucracies in the Pentagon and at the very highest levels proved far less adaptive, far less willing to re-question their assumptions and think of new ways of doing things than the tactical units that were on the front lines of combat.
Actually, Professor Barno, before we get to your answer about how to think about it, Professor Bensahel, I want to push you a little bit further on this. Our colleague, Professor Paula Thornhill, talks about this idea of accountability soup, which I find just downright fascinating. You're not really sure who to blame for when things don't go right. But frankly, the tale you all paint of General Casey seems pretty clear. And we know that actually he goes on to a pretty big promotion. Can you talk us through what effect you think that might have had in terms of folks' views on kind of adaptability?
Yeah, it was pretty common knowledge among fielded troops that strategy wasn't working. I remember talking with people coming back from Iraq, and in my case, a bit afterwards in Iraq itself, talking to U.S. troops, and they all knew the strategy wasn't working. I shouldn't paint it with quite that broad a brush, but we talked to a lot of people who understood that the strategy wasn't working. But again, at those highest levels, those basic assumptions were not being revisited. Ultimately, in the book, we paint not just an unflattering portrait of Casey's adaptability, but also we think appropriately compare him to General Westmoreland in Vietnam, even though we've read that he hates that comparison. Ultimately, we think it's a fair one, because Westmoreland, as of course you know, was incredibly rigid in his approach to the Vietnam War. It was his way. It was the enemy body count and conventional offensive operations. And when he left in 1968, he was promoted also to the Army Chief of Staff position when he came out, which is, of course, what happened to George Casey as well. I think that decision really sent some very negative feedback loops, feedback back down through the force, that someone who many of the people under his command knew had not been able to adapt to the circumstances there became the Chief of Staff of the Army.
Thanks for sharing that. Professor Barno, what are your thoughts?
No, it's a complex subject. We found, I think, a clear trend, I would say, that as you noted, at the tactical level, junior and mid-grade U.S. commanders were quite adaptable and pretty effective. We cite the case of then Colonel Sean McFarland, retired later as a 3-star general many years later, in his work around Ramadi and in his inventing of his own counterinsurgency strategy and the great success he had there with that as a colonel, even though that was really developing tactics that were not agreed upon by General Casey and his headquarters at a higher level. And we talk about the horse soldiers, Army Special Forces in Afghanistan, really being an incredible example of adaptability, going in the first days after the 9/11 attacks and actually teaching themselves to ride horses to accompany the Afghan Northern Alliance forces to use U.S. air power against the Taliban. So, I mean, there's a lot of examples, and it shows up on the technological side too, with hillbilly armor as the local response to roadside bombs when the vehicles the U.S. had in Iraq weren't adequate to be able to protect soldiers from the casualties they were taking when that particular enemy weapon showed up on the battlefield. But I'd also say that one of the worrisome things to me, and I think one of the big takeaways of the book, is that at the institutional level, not just the theater level where we're talking about who's running the war in Baghdad or in Kabul, but at the institutional level back in Washington, we almost could paint a unremitting picture of poor adaptation, in that there was actually in some ways a robust fight going on that if you were out in the fighting zone, in the combat zone, it almost looked like the the role of some of the senior leaders back there was to prevent you from getting what you needed to have. And whether that was MRAPs and how long it took MRAPs to get to the field in Iraq, because the senior leadership of the Army and the Marine Corps fought that, and actually Secretary Gates had to override all of the recommendations from every one of his senior military leaders in the Pentagon to push the MRAPs out really saved a significant number of U.S. troops' lives in Iraq. Or if it was we use the example of the Army's Program of Record Intelligence System called D6A, and the battle out there in Afghanistan in particular to try and get a commercial software, intelligence software available from Palantir to be able to do things very rapidly with a lot of ease by the user that couldn't be done by D6A, and how that was fought tooth and nail by the Army's bureaucracy back in the Pentagon. And those are very unsettling stories. We actually drew a parallel with some of the things that the Army did in World War II with its inability to get a new tank out to soldiers, even though the primary U.S. tank was outmatched by the Germans for the last 3 years of the war. So there's some very interesting parallels there. And I think that's a deep overriding flaw in the U.S. system right now, is the ability of institutions and their leaders back in Washington to adapt to the needs of the troops in the field.
I know it's incredible to read those examples that you give, especially because, what I find so curious, there was no shortage of assessments, right? You had folks constantly saying, so how's it going? What are we doing? And yet, looking back, it seems like you all have come out with, some really, really clear findings. And so it wasn't that folks weren't asking the question. Perhaps it's that they weren't ready to hear certain answers, or perhaps it was the way they were asking the question. I don't know if you have kind of an answer along those lines.
I think that's part of it. I think people held on to their views despite evidence that was coming in that suggested new approaches were needed. But in the examples that Professor Barno just gave, about the technologies, about the MRAPs and the Palantir versus D6A, a lot of that was bureaucratic imperatives. And also in those cases, a split between the services as the, sorry, my cat is joining the call, that's her tail.
She's very strong views on adaptation.
She does, and I decided to, sometimes I close them out of my home office, but they are well-loved features in class, and so I decided to let them stay for today's talk. There's an inherent tension between the role of the services and the combatant commands. The combatant commands are responsible for fighting today. They were the ones that were overseeing. Central Command was overseeing the fights in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Whereas the services, as defined by the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, which we teach in Strat, their mission is to look towards the future. It's to organize, train, and equip for the future. Which means that they're not always as responsive to the needs of soldiers, sailors, airmen and Marines who are in the fight. So, a lot of this comes back to bureaucratic politics. Where you stand depends on where you sit. A lot of those folks in both of the stories that we tell about the MRAPs and about the D6A were examples of services wanting to protect their preferred investments, even though it was very clear that another technological solution would help save the lives of those who were in combat. And the prioritizing of future vehicle needs over the MRAP, for example, at a time when Congress would have been more than happy to fund both, really is a very cautionary story about the bureaucratic pull of the services and their need to be able to be adaptable to support troops on the ground when there is a threat that is affecting their people.
Absolutely. So I'm going to, oh, sorry, please.
A pretty well-known senator at the time said this would be like Roosevelt asking Eisenhower, are you sure you need all those landing craft for D-Day? What are we going to use them for after the war? And that, of course, was a question that never got asked. But that's the nature of this issue of the MRAP in particular. Why we can't afford to buy all these things. There's no purpose for them. They don't fit into our future view of how we're going to fight this force. And they're incredibly expensive. We need to just stop this and buy as few as possible and invest in our next tactical vehicle, which won't be out for another 10 years. And that's not really a facetious commentary. That's a fairly accurate depiction of what happened.
Yeah, and just for the record, that other vehicle was the JLTV, which entered operational service just a few years ago. It was 10 years out from that time.
Incredible, incredible. And it seemed like so many folks had sort of this short war assumption anyway. And then, you know, it was those, you know, so why spend the money? Why go through the fight with Congress? Until it was really, I think it was like a USA Today article that really forced it in front of SecDef Gates's, you know, head and realized I've got to sort of personally run this, which is not ideal. It's not kind of what you want your SecDef to have to.
Over the advice of all of his military advisors.
It's extraordinary. I'm going to ask two more questions and then I will turn to the Q&A. I see we already have some smart questions from students. Please feel free to throw those in. Next one is about this piece of technology, right? So you've got your triumvirate of doctrine, technology, and leadership. Technology obviously is essential to how we think about adaptability, but there's also a lot of an obsession with technology, sort of this, you know, desire to find the whiz bang gizmo. Can you talk us through what it can and kind of can't do? What are those limits?
Well, I'll take a stab at that, and it's actually a topic that we talked about in our Adaptation Under Fire class this week, and we actually have, and we're kind of chronologically going through, we just finished the wars, mostly of the 20th century. We're now, you know, just turned to Iraq and Afghanistan, and one of the things that, you know, we talk about the wizard war, which is the war of technology as we go through a variety of different conflicts. In just looking at how the U.S. fights, the U.S. has always invested very heavily and believed very deeply in the efficacy of technology to win its wars, and that there's a very strong logic of that. Was you want to send, you know, bullets where you don't want to send people, and you want to be able to dominate your enemy with firepower, but there's a belief that because we have the most advanced technologies in the world, surely that will be adequate to overcome any adversary, no matter what kind of a profile that they present out there. And I think the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan both are sobering reminders that that is not true, that technology can be outflanked, it can be neutralized, it can be undercut, it can be out adapted in effect. And that's one of our premises as well, is there's this constant war of adaptation and counter-adaptation and counter-adaptation. The enemy never sits still. And the U.S. really relies and falls back on its technological supremacy almost as a default to overcome adversaries without maybe thinking through adequately the other things you need to think about. Do you have the right doctrine? Are we actually thinking about the strategy properly? Are we resourcing this correctly? What's the long game going to look like? Because we have so many technological silver bullets that we can apply, we're certain that they're going to be adequate. So it's a philosophical challenge. I think the U.S. military has to really think hard if it's going to not fall into that trap in every single war it fights.
Absolutely, especially this point that you were making earlier, Professor Bensahel, about just sort of the exponential change as we think about the global security environment. You know, to the extent technology was never going to be a panacea, given sort of the constant tactical factor and these counter moves you're highlighting, Professor Barno, that's even going to be more so the case, it would think, you know, one would think.
No, that's absolutely right. And, you know, one of the things we emphasize is that once a war or a conflict starts, you are stuck with the technology you have for the initial battles, right? Getting a new piece of technology takes a while, and it requires that institutional level of adaptability that did not go very well in the recent wars. But we do talk in our recommendations about some of the implications for the types of technologies that we should be focusing on procuring. And, you know, we in the United States tend to procure small numbers of highly exquisite, sophisticated, technologically advanced platforms like an aircraft carrier or the F-35 that are enormously expensive, but that are very small in number in a lot of ways. You know, the type of environment we're going into, we talk about this in the conclusion, other authors have written about it, because of the proliferation of technology at, you know, becoming cheaper and cheaper every passing day. Future wars may involve more mass than precision, because the future environment is going to be so lethal because of all of these technologies. The US probably doesn't have the right types of cheap mass capabilities where it's okay to lose some of them in the conduct of the war. If we lose an aircraft carrier, that is going to have an enormous strategic effect beyond any operational or tactical effect. Those would be bad, but the strategic effect of it would be enormous. If we lose, you know, a few drones in a drone swarm that's attacking, for example, that creates no strategic consequences. So we also need to be thinking about how this technology changes our ability to create effect and what some of the strategic consequences are of relying on vulnerable, highly technologically sophisticated capabilities of the types that the United States has tended to procure.
Absolutely. So I'm going to hold my very last question so we can get some of the student ones, and I'll hit you all at that just before we end. So first, we have a question from one of our current students who's asking your thoughts of the current senior leadership of the Pentagon, civilian and military. Do you think they're able to adapt quickly enough to meet these sorts of challenges that you're worried about?
Well, in a sense, this is arguable, but in a sense, we're in an interwar period. We're in between major conflicts. And even though we're fighting, insurgents and terrorists in Syria, in Iraq, and to a lesser extent now in Afghanistan, we're not in a period of major war. And so this is a period that we would characterize as innovation, that this is what you're doing is thinking about creative ways to approach the problem without having the pressure of an enemy who's actually pushing you off the edge of the map sheet and adapting and inflicting casualties, et cetera. So the question might be, are we set up adequately for that interwar period right now? And then another question is that also setting us up for being able to be adaptable when this big conflict happens, which is perhaps out there not far over the horizon. So I think on innovation, I see some fairly innovative things, and that's always a fraught question to answer. What do you think of Mr. X, who's the secretary of whatever in the Pentagon? But I actually think the senior Pentagon leadership right now, Secretary Esper, Deputy Secretary of Defense also, the service chiefs are being pretty creative, and they are struggling with this shift to a major new adversary in China that has immense capabilities and potential far beyond anything the United States has faced before. They're struggling with the fact they have a legacy force that was built for another generation or 2 generations removed from what we are today, and that they're coming out of 20 years of irregular conflict, and that they are struggling with the fact they're going to have their budgets be reduced probably substantially in the coming years, and they're going to have to make some really difficult choices. So I see some glimmers of the right directions coming out of there, but they're going to have to overcome a tremendous amount of service log rolling and protecting programs and wanting to maintain end strength. So the jury's out on where that's all going to go. We can talk a bit more about the adaptation and preparing for adaptation part of that, I'd say, as well.
Yeah, that's how I was going to take on that question. As I said at the outset, we are concerned that the U.S. military is not adaptable enough for the challenges of the future. And we mean that without regard to the individuals who hold those offices. We would be equally concerned if the upcoming election produces, a different Pentagon leadership. We would still have this same concern. Mm-hmm. In our recommendations, one of the things that we both feel most strongly about is that the way that leaders are educated and prepared for especially those senior level positions needs to focus more on adaptability. We have many specific conclusions in the book, and we're happy to talk about those. But one of the biggest ones has to do with professional military education, particularly at that senior service college or war college level, a little bit above the one that students come to us at SICE for, although some do. Most of ours are more at the intermediate level of the professional military education. We're very concerned that that level does not include enough true diversity of thought of people of different backgrounds to really create new thinking. That sometimes seminars that they do have diversity in terms of people from different services. They're usually international students in there. You'll often occasionally get a lone civilian, but usually from the Defense Department, maybe State Department or USAID. That's still a very similar demographic to have in a room, particularly when it's dominated by people who are all in the military. And that does not necessarily go far enough in terms of helping people think creatively, thinking outside of the box, being provoked with exercises and games and unscripted scenarios that they really have to think about in new and very creative ways. So we do include a number of things that we think PME, professional military education, needs to get more rigorous and focus on that. But there are certain limits. You're never going to have the kind of diversity in a PME classroom as you are in civilian graduate school. And so that's why we say civilian graduate funded slots for civilian graduate education need to be increased. They've been slashed over the past 2 decades to a fraction of what they once were, largely because the service colleges now provide their own accredited master's degrees. But those are not the same as being in a civilian institution where you're surrounded by a 22-year-old with pink hair and people who haven't thought a lot about the military in their lives, professors who come from a very different background and are willing to challenge their views in a way that just doesn't happen when people often share the same background. So we don't think that that should replace professional military education, but that it is a very, very critical additional thing that must be added. And Professor Barno has talked in a couple of our book talks and in other environments about how, you know, his graduate degree from Georgetown in what was the predecessor of the security studies program was one of the things that affected him the most when in command.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's when I read the National Defense Strategy, I was a little bit floored at just how bluntly it took on professional military education. It's like it was as harsh toward China as it was toward professional military education, which is, you know, I'm really hard pressed to think of another, you know, departmental level document that would speak that way. And I think, you know, it's a heavy endorsement for this idea of having different sorts of folks around the table, obviously, as we do it at a place like SAIS. I'd like to turn to another student question, which is asking about alliances and kind of as you think about adapting for different types of conflict in the future, what do you think the U.S. is going to assume of its closest allies? How are they going to, you know, how will the U.S. think about their emerging roles and their responsibilities? Will we conceptualize them differently, or is this kind of just going to be the same old thing?
Well, a lot of that has to do with the political leadership of the country, and that is one thing that I think will be different if Biden wins the election next week, as opposed to if Trump wins a second term. They have very different views and philosophies about the role of allies in U.S. national security. From the perspective of adaptation, though, you know, there are always challenges in working with our coalition partners and our allies because of mismatch of capabilities. The U.S. usually has far more capabilities certainly in logistics, conventional warfare, and some other ways than our allies and partners do. But one of the things that we think is really important for adaptability is having realistic exercise programs. We're fairly critical of some of the exercise programs that occur at the highest levels of the US military. They tend to be good at small units and below, say the brigade level and below, the types that go to the National Training Center, for example, for the Army. But service level and joint staff exercises, the really big ones, tend to include all too optimistic assumptions. Sometimes they're heavily scripted. They often are used to justify programmatic descriptions and concepts that the sponsoring organization wants to put forward rather than to allow free play and adaptability. This is a bigger issue than the question of allies, of course, but the reason why I mention it here is because one of the things that often happens in these types of exercises is that the US players in these exercises and war games play the role of US allies. And so they may or may not be making correct assumptions about what that ally is politically willing to provide in addition, you know, beyond just what their capabilities are. So, you know, that can be very politically fraught to have allies playing themselves in a war game, especially if they're going to say no to things that the US wants. But, you know, I think that is one way that US forces need to make sure that they are more adaptable to realistically assess what the contributions, not just military, but the strategic and grand strategic political contributions will be of allies and partners, and then realistically exercise that to continue holding multilateral exercises to improve interoperability and so on.
I agree with that. I would just add that, you know, the other place the allies, we don't call upon them, and they could be very helpful, is to play the adversary and to help us shape the adversarial picture, because our goal is to make our allies like us. We really want our allies to be more like someone else. They need to be more like themselves. And we actually don't want them to be simply a mirror image of the U.S. military. And their perspectives, particularly the regional perspectives that they bring to the table, are going to be very different in many cases than what American officers will bring to the table. So having them get very deeply involved in helping to shape these very challenging scenarios and to create an adversary that's not just a retired version of the, you know, Army general across the table who's the same person, just 10 years older. scripting the enemy. That's not what we need. And they can give us some really good insights, I think, on the regional challenges and dealing with other potential opponents out there.
Absolutely. Those are such thoughtful points, right? Who are actually playing these roles? Yeah, it's often disheartening and not really jumping at those points that you all are highlighting on diversity of experience or background. So there's a great question from one of our students talking about the Army and the Air Force and how they've been thinking about adaptation these days. So to sort of very superficially try to summarize this good question, right? The Army went really big. The Army's got Army Futures Command. It's sort of this giant endeavor, if you will. And the Air Force has a rather awkward acronym, AFWIC, and they're sort of trying to use their slightly awkward acronym to have kind of what is supposed to be a much smaller bureaucratic presence, to kind of work as an appendage, if you will, to the big bureaucracy and try to push kind of adaptation and innovation, if you will, from that. I guess your thoughts on how those are going, and if you think one is wrong. I mean, it seems to me your book actually may be suggesting that big bureaucracy may not be quite the way to accomplish adaptation. If that's true, what would you advise them?
We just had the opportunity to speak to AFWIC here, I think in May, and talk to them in a very large Zoom group here. I'm not sure we knew exactly what it was when we started, but it was one of the most impressive groups of people that we've spoken with in the last 6 months about how the military is going to be changing in the aftermath of COVID-19 rising, changing the strategic picture out there as well. And it was, I personally was very, very impressed by the number of, bright thinkers they had in there. There were young folks. It wasn't a room full of generals and colonels. There were people from very unconventional backgrounds in the Air Force. They were asking really good questions, and they were doing it in a very, I thought, uniquely unorthodox way that would help kind of break down the hierarchical stovepipes you normally have. So I don't know a great deal more about what they're producing, but their process and what that particular couple-hour event told me is that looked like a pretty strong way to have some really bright ideas brought to the table. Quickly on Army Futures Command, I think the jury's still out on how effective that's going to be. It's taking things out of the old training and doctrine command and particularly focused on developing critical capabilities for the future. There have been a couple decisions, I think, that have come at least indirectly out of Army Futures Command recently, which go at absolute counterpoints to what we've said in the book, which is you need to empower and increase resourcing for your very successful ad hoc rapid adaptation organizations like the Asymmetric Warfare Group, which is now being inactivated, like the Rapid Equipping Force, which is now being inactivated, like in the latest one this past week, the Red Team University is now being inactivated. And so these are all things that suggest that everything is mitigating, or everything is migrating to the top of a centralized bureaucracy, and these small ad hoc, unusual organizations, unorthodox organizations, some of which were incredibly effective during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, of getting around the big bureaucracy, are now being taken out of the system. That is not a good sign in my view.
Yeah, we talked extensively with the Asymmetrical Warfare Group, and we're extraordinarily impressed with them. We sort of, our advice to them was change your name to the Adaptability Warfare Group, because that's essentially what they were doing. I think that their name got caught in, well, we don't do asymmetric warfare anymore, which is of course ridiculous. We're going to have elements of that in any conventional conflict as well. So I think Futures Command is a mixed bag. I think it is, these organizations are set up to get around the big bureaucracies, and the fact they're being eliminated is the big bureaucracies, which Futures Command certainly is reasserting themselves. Mm-hmm. That said, the Army is doing some other things which I think are really important that will help adaptability. Chief of Staff General McConville is a former G1, the head of Army personnel, and has instituted some changes to the way that that battalion commanders are selected, and now that's being extended to brigade commanders as well, that we think could be revolutionary. And probably we only have 10 minutes left, so we won't go into any detail there, but we're big fans of those programs. We think they're enormous steps in the right direction to help ensure that the leaders who are chosen for those very, very important commands, and who therefore are upwardly mobile, well, right? The people that are, you have to have been a battalion commander to become a brigade commander. You have to have been a brigade commander to be promoted to flag officer rank in the Army, for example. That those changes will absolutely help ensure that the most senior service leaders are more adaptable than they have been when they've been selected through more traditional mechanisms.
Great. Well, it's an interesting mixed bag that you both are seeing, you know, some really important bureaucratic change on the leadership front and some much less so perhaps in kind of how one approaches problems with this kind of overly centralized system. So next question comes from one of our great SICE professors who wants to get your thoughts on how the force is doing in adapting for asymmetric warfare in the future. And specifically, he's asking things like, you know, to what extent are folks kind of manifesting kind of an appreciation of adaptability as it relates to, say, losing air superiority, as it relates to degraded communications, loss of GPS. What are your thoughts? Are you seeing some good progress on that front, or do you think the jury's still out on that?
I think that some of those things are some of the key questions about what the operational environment is going to look like for U.S. military forces in a conventional conflict. That's not really about asymmetric conflict, right? We didn't have to worry about air superiority in Iraq and Afghanistan because we weren't facing, you know, after the first couple of days of initial combat, you know, especially in Iraq, you know, we didn't have an air threat. So I do think things like degraded communications and so on are things that are percolating in this new focus on great power competition, and particularly with a focus on China. Secretary Esper has now come out and said that China is, quote, the pacing threat. That means that it's essentially the highest priority for the United States strategically. You know, he has also recently mandated that 50% of all instruction in professional military education has to focus on China, even if we agree that China is the right primary threat and we have to be prepared for it. I'm not sure that's a great way to promote adaptability across the board. So, you know, I think that there is in all of the services planning and thinking about great power competition in the emerging joint warfighting concept, which the Pentagon is working on. I do think there is an understanding that a lot of the enabling capabilities that we have taken for granted might not be available. But, you know, how well they're doing and actually preparing for war fighting in those domains. Are they actually allowing their units and subordinate units to train in those kinds of environments to ensure that they're adaptable enough? I think that is still very much an open question.
Yeah, I guess I'd add that I think our systems of warfighting now are built upon having full capabilities, and they're not designed to operate at 70%, 60%, 20%. And our leaders have no experience in actually operating in those kinds of degraded positions, whether it's not being able to determine your position because GPS is out, or having your battlefield Blue Force tracker not be able to show you where all your units are anymore, and having to go back to maps instead of GPS directed navigation. We do a little bit of that in our training centers to put people through the ringer, but it's so hard that we stop it pretty quickly and put them back into being able to use all their capabilities, because we're trying to get them to be trained in their capabilities that they have today. Well, if those capabilities aren't going to be there on day 1, 2, 3, or 5 of the next war, maybe we ought to be spending more time in ensuring that our doctrine takes that into account and that we're ready to make that big shift, that big adaptation. Overall, one of the things I think we found is that the U.S. military today is immensely vested in preparation for the next war, but doesn't put anything remotely close to that much effort into thinking about how to develop the adaptability when that preparation is not for the right war. That you are going to build the perfect mix of what you need to do, but you don't spend anything close to the amount of effort you're putting into making sure you've got everything for that operations plan in place, to thinking of when this all goes wrong, how are we making sure our force is resilient enough and has contingencies enough and has enough ability to operate with everything down or broken or degraded to be able to be successful. We spend very little time on that. We don't exercise that, certainly to failure, in our exercise program, and that will cost us eventually.
One of the things we recommend in the book, which may sound semantic, but it's not, we recommend adopting adaptability as a principle of war. The military has a list of key principles of war. And we think that adding adaptability to that list will help ensure that things like exercises trained to them, that do offer opportunities to adapt and to learn. The best way to prepare to be adaptable is to adapt a lot, right? This is the, a version of Eisenhower's old comment about planning, right? Plans are nothing, planning is everything. It doesn't matter what the specific adaptation is that comes out of an exercise. The way you get more adaptable is to practice adapting a lot and get that mindset of flexibility, of creative problem solving. And that's what we want to see much more attention paid to.
Indeed, and getting used to that. I'm going to offer one more great question from the audience, and then my wrap-up question. Terrific and thoughtful question. If the U.S. military is not sufficiently set up for adaptation, who should we look to? Right? Are there militaries that do it better? Do we need to go all the way back to the Prussians and just obsess over the Prussian general staff? Who's doing it well? Who's maybe even doing it best? And why do you think that's the case?
Well, I alluded to what we think the answer is at the beginning, which is the US military may still be the most adaptable military in the world, but given the amount of adaptation that the US military may be required to do in the future, it might still not be enough. Right? Again, right now, the entire Department of Defense is focused on great power competition. That was the 2018 National Defense Strategy. And as I mentioned, Secretary Esper has said China is the pacing threat. 50% of all instruction and professional military education focus on China. That's great if the next fight is China. That may not be so great if the next fight is an unconventional war somewhere in Europe that has, elements of Russian aggression with a combination of traditional forces, but more likely the types of little green men and other guerrilla tactics that we've seen in Ukraine. Again, the United States military has so much it might need to adapt to across that conflict spectrum that we could be doing it better than our allies and adversaries and still not be good enough at it for what we face in the future.
Yeah, I don't think there's any defined answer to who's better at it, and even if that may be the most important metric to use to judge. One of the risks we point out in the book is that our adversaries in the coming years will almost always have a first mover advantage, that they are going to take the aggressive stance first. They are going to attack. They're going to do something to force the U.S. to react. And if that first move is powerful enough, there may not be another move. There may not be an adaptation they have to make. They may succeed if the U.S. is unable to absorb the challenge that comes in that first really major move, or in those first few days or weeks. That may be end of the war at that point in time. So I think that it's incumbent in a lot of ways on the U.S. to be better at this than anybody else is out there, and to force ourselves to realize we're always going to have to absorb that first blow. We're always going to be the second mover. And that means we're going to have to change, because whatever happened in that first move probably did not come to our advantage. We probably didn't come out of that well. And now what are we going to do? How are we going to adjust that? What's got to change? What systems work? Where were we attacked that we didn't expect? So I think that there's a really deep-seated requirement for us to be really good at this. And I worry too that our hubris, by telling ourselves we're the best military in the history of the world for the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, has gotten us into the mindset that, who's better than us? We don't have to worry about this. We've got this. This is what we do. And I think that's extraordinarily dangerous.
Absolutely. All right. So in our last 90 seconds, I'm going to ask you an unfair question, which is, you have all of these great recommendations. If you can only get one achieved, what's the one recommendation you want to make sure folks are hearing from you that they're trying to implement?
I would probably pick the professional military education ones, because the education is so valuable, right? Because we are talking about this as a mindset. I think if we could only pick one, I think the investment in leader education would probably be the single biggest one.
Yeah, we would default to leadership, I think, for sure, because we eventually concluded that is the most important of the three elements of the triangle there. And I think my angle on that would be enhanced outside of PME, outside of the military education and the civilian education system. Get these leaders in different audiences, get them exposed to younger people, get them exposed to diverse thinking, and expose them to technology, which they know virtually nothing about in at least two of our services. That's very, very dangerous.
Thank you both so much for that. This was terrific. I have enjoyed it. It is already becoming like a holy text for me. And I know that will be the case for folks who get it. It was a treat to see all of you. I'm delighted we had such thoughtful questions and comments, and I'm excited to see what's next.
Thank you so much. That was a terrific conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. We enjoyed it. Great
Thank
to see you.
Y'all take care. Bye.
Be well.